On an early November evening in 1996, a black Mercedes, traveling at nearly 110 miles per hour, crashed into a truck near Susurluk in western Turkey. 3 of the 4 passengers in the car died instantly. When a few local journalists arrived at the scene, they had expected to find a irregular car accident. But what they discovered would shock Turkey to the core.
İyi akşamlar sayın seyirciler. Türkiye'yi sarsan Susurluk kazası.
Among the accident victims, notorious contract killer for a CIA-assisted secret organization, Abdullah Çatlı, who was also a leader of the fascist Grey Wolves and an underworld drug lord wanted by Interpol, and his girlfriend, former beauty queen Gonca Uz. So far so good, nothing to be shocked about. But who else was in this car? The third victim, Istanbul Deputy Police Chief Hüseyin Kocadağ. The fourth person, the seriously injured Sedat Bucak, was a conservative member of parliament who was also a big landowner and a leader of several state-supported village guard units engaged in the war against Kurdish liberation fighters. Now, this is not good. Why the hell were a police chief, a politician, and a fascist criminal in the same car? It's not as if these people just happened to share an Uber pool or something. No serious arrests were made after the incident, and the concrete ties between the passengers remain shrouded in mystery to this day. In what came to be known as the Susurluk scandal, parliamentary investigations scratched the surface of a vast shadow network involved in one of the bloodiest and most mysterious periods in the modern history of Turkey. An interconnected web of Turkish police, military, secret service, politicians, criminal bosses, fascist paramilitaries, and the CIA, united by a common goal: eliminate communism. Turkey, officially the Republic of Turkey, is situated on the Anatolian Peninsula in Western Asia, spanning across 2 continents, giving it an important geopolitical position and making it a regional power of significance. As an early member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, the Turkish armed forces constitute the second largest standing military force in NATO. Turkey also hosts the Incirlik Air Base operated and controlled by the US Air Force, which served as a main hub for operations during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Ankara, Turkey's second largest city, serves as the nation's capital, while Istanbul, its largest city, acts as the primary financial hub. Turkey currently ranks as the world's 20th largest economy in terms of nominal GDP. This February, more than 50,000 people lost their lives following the terrifying earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, and the disastrous effects and the response are dramatically worsened by the profit-based system and the according corruption of the government. Kurdish regions are hit especially hard, and there's a history behind this. Turkey was already in a horrible situation this year, with inflation soaring and its currency collapsing. On top of it, the country is headed toward the general election on May 14, in which the current president is expected to use all available means to stay in power. His opponent, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, leader of the Republican People's Party, or short CHP, formed an alliance appealing to voters from the liberal left to the conservative right. We'll look at the important history of that party soon. Since 2002, Turkey's political system has been under the rule of the Justice and Development Party, or AKP, and its leader Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. Under Erdoğan, the country has faced recession and stagnation in the last decade, accompanied by high inflation in this year, and went through a shift from a parliamentary republic to an executive presidential system, eroding the so-called separation of powers in bourgeois democracy. Traditionally, the prime minister position has been more important, but since the 2017 referendum, the prime minister position has been abolished, and now the president has much greater executive power. In order to more fully grasp Turkish politics, Turkey's role within imperialism today, and the roots of the fascistic character of its political system, we need to turn the clock back by exactly 100 years. After the Ottoman Empire broke apart 1 century ago, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed in 1923 after the so-called War of Independence by the country's first president, Ebedi Şef, Eternal Chief, Mustafa Kemal, honored with the name Atatürk, Father of the Turks, and the founder of the oldest political party of Turkey, the aforementioned Republican People's Party, or CHP. But Turkey didn't actually gain real independence. It was still a semi-colonial country. What does that mean? Before the War of Independence, the Ottoman Empire had been declining as it was ridden with crises and got outcompeted by the Western European imperialist powers. It was considered the sick man of Europe. As it slowly dissolved, it was economically dependent on Germany and was pressured to fight on its side during World War I. After the loss of the Central Powers, it got pillaged by French and British capital. The European imperialists were about to seize much of trade and industry, and the Turkish ruling class faced a life-or-death struggle. The emerging bourgeoisie, or capitalist class, united with the feudal gentry and the landlords, managed to take leadership in the independence struggle and consolidated the republic under a one-party state, formally abolishing the Sultanate and liberating the occupied territories. But the Turkish economy remained dependent, i.e., it provided cheap raw materials and workforce to the imperialists and opened a market for their industrial products. Large banks, transport routes, as well as parts of industry were still in the hands of foreign companies. This dependency would lead Turkey into a huge trade deficit in the 40s, further seeking foreign loans, subjugating the country and holding back independent industrial development. But not everyone lost due to this dependency. The Turkish capitalist class made a massive fortune through this collaboration in exploiting the toiling masses in Turkey, seizing properties of Anatolian Greeks and Armenians, and pandered to the imperialists' fear of rising communism after the October Revolution in Russia in 1917. And anti-communism would unite them throughout the century, both ideologically and in terms of concrete organization. This analysis was key for one of the, if not the most notable Turkish communist, Ibrahim Kaypakkaya, who would later criticize the Turkish left, which proposed such things as emphasizing an alliance with the Kemalist movement, painting them as an independent progressive revolutionary force. However, Kaypakkaya wrote, quote, "The Kemalists, even during the years of the Liberation War, were embarking on collaboration with the imperialists. They did not neglect to carry out covert collaboration with them against the Socialist Soviet Union externally and against communists, working class, and other toiling people internally. On the other hand, while raining down the most extreme compliments in order to obtain aid, on the other were seeking a basis for secret agreements to be made with the US, Britain, and France. The Kemalist dictatorship is a military fascist dictatorship over the workers, peasants, urban petty bourgeoisie, low-ranking public servants, and Democrat intellectuals." Toward the end of the 19th century, Marxist ideas had begun to penetrate Turkish society, and various Turkish communist groups had begun to emerge, not just in Turkey. Some émigré workers in Germany, referred to as the Turkish Spartakists, had joined up with Rosa Luxemburg and the other Spartakists in Germany, and sought to bring the lessons of the November Revolution back home. These groups would then merge into the Communist Party of Turkey, or short TKP, in Baku. Only 1 year after the TKP was founded in 1920, its founder, Mustafa Sufi, and the entire 14-member leadership were brutally assassinated, most likely on the order of Mustafa Kemal, after being lured on a boat at the Black Sea. Sufi's Russian wife, Maria, was taken hostage, abused, and used as a sex slave by the murderers. In 1923, the state closed down the Istanbul Workers' Association, arrested its leaders, and formed its own bourgeois unions to draw people away from workers' organizations. Already in 1920, Mustafa Kemal had set up a fake puppet communist party to counter the growing influence of the actual communists. The actual Communist Party was then banned in 1925 and had to operate underground throughout the 20th century. In 1927, railway workers organized a massive strike lasting for 2 weeks against a French company operating in Turkey. Hundreds of workers and their family members laid down on the tracks, and the Kemalist government dispatched a military unit which opened fire on the unarmed workers and their families, covering the rails in blood. With the extensive adoption of the Codice Rocco, the fascist penal code enacted under Mussolini in Italy, paragraphs 141 and 142 found their way into Turkish law, prohibiting any organization of class-based associations and imposing the death penalty on anyone leading them. The Atatürk reforms made Turkey into a secular modern state. But Mustafa Kemal also wanted to create a homogeneous Turkey. What was meant by this, the minority ethnic groups had to experience brutally. The Kurds, living predominantly in the southeast or in northern Kurdistan, make up around 20 to 25% of Turkey's population. Atatürk called them Mountain Turks, banned the Kurdish language in schools, prohibiting speaking Kurdish in public spaces, Kurdish newspapers, and Kurdish parties. Hundreds of thousands of Kurds were forcibly deported out of Turkey to Turkify the region. After Kurds rebelled against the repression, the state initiated a pogrom in the Kurdish majority region of Diyarbakir, burning down villages and killing over 15,000 people. Later in the 30s, the Turkish armed forces were sent to crush a Zaza Kurdish rebellion in the notorious Dersim genocide, in which tens of thousands of people were massacred. Atatürk's Turkification was in line with the previous regime of the Young Turks, which committed the Armenian genocide, murdering over 1.5 million Armenians, with only a fraction of the Armenian population surviving. The Turkish government denies the genocide to this day. From 1935, German imperialism would regain its influence over Turkey. Germany helped train Turkish soldiers and was Turkey's primary source for armaments, and the Nazis would find great admiration among their quickly growing Turkish counterparts. Ultranationalists in Turkey had excellent relations with Nazi Germany, and its most notorious representative, Colonel Alparslan Türkeş, was the contact person of the Nazis in Turkey. He would frequently quote Hitler's Mein Kampf in his speeches, and his so-called pan-Turkist movement's support for Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini was strong. Ruzi Nazar, another prominent pan-Turkist, joined the Nazis on the Eastern Front to fight for the creation of a Turkestan. Nazar was later recruited by the Americans and became the CIA's station chief in Turkey. More on that later. The pseudoscientific pan-Turkism movement, with its doctrine of racial superiority, sees as its goal the political and cultural unification of all Turkic peoples. Since many ethnic Turks lived in the Soviet Union, the movement naturally linked its reactionary ideology to the destruction of the Soviet Union and communism. It was not until 1945, when Turkey declared war on Germany, when it was pretty much clear that they were losing. Nazi Germany was defeated, but fascism was not. In collaboration with the new imperialist master, the United States, the pan-Turkist leaders would play a key role in the brutal unleashing of fascist violence against the left in Turkey. After the defeat of Nazi Germany, the US was by far the dominant capitalist imperialist power in the world. But there was no time to rest for the Yankees. There was still a more potent enemy out there, growing in popularity, not least due to the Soviet Union's central role in the defeat of Hitler. US President Harry Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, a plan to contain the Soviet Union and rising communist organization, particularly in Greece and Turkey, by asking Congress for $400 million in military and economic assistance, specifically for Greece and Turkey. In his address to Congress in 1947, Truman stressed, quote, "Should we fail Greece and Turkey in this fateful hour, the effect will be far-reaching to the West as well as to the East. We must take immediate and resolute action." The request was approved in 1948, the same year when Turkey joined the Marshall Plan and was admitted into the IMF. The United States was now the chief imperialist partner of the Turkish state, but it was more than just a partner. Meanwhile, in 1948, in northern Turkey, a certain someone, whom the Turkish state would consider as the most dangerous revolutionary and a serious threat to the government, saw the light of day. Born into a poor peasant Alevi family, Ibrahim Kaypakkaya would later become the foremost manifestation of the revolutionary communist line of the Turkish proletariat. A symbol of camaraderie and the armed struggle, he would live a short life, but an important one. At the time of his birth, the Turkish government underwent certain changes to adapt to the new imperialist world order. Within the Turkish ruling class, a variety of cliques with competing interests formed their separate parties. The newly created center-right Democrat Party, or short DP, was one of them, founded by former members of the CHP, most prominently by the soon infamous Prime Minister Adnan Menderes. The shift from a one-party government to a multi-party state wasn't out of an idealist concern for democracy. The then President İsmet İnönü, known as the right-hand man of Mustafa Kemal, knew very well that if opposition parties weren't included, Turkey would fall to social rebellion. Calls for freedom of speech and so on were of course justified, but primarily it was because, quote, "the comprador big bourgeoisie and landlords clique in opposition wanted the same thing for themselves." On the other hand, the international situation is forcing the bourgeoisie and landlord class to adopt parliament, since an open terrorist dictatorship that abolishes parliament will expose its fascist visage both to the popular masses domestically and world public opinion and be isolated. This is the function of parliament in Turkey, to mask fascism. The government had introduced a trade union law which was supposed to fulfill the, quote, "necessity of Western democracy," legalizing the formation of trade unions, but maintaining the ban on strikes. Unions also had to be apolitical and, quote, "nationally oriented" instead of internationalist. In order to control the emerging labor movement, the Turkish Ministry of Labor, with the help of US advisors, such as the anti-communist organizer and later leader of the US Trade Union Federation, AFL-CIO, Irving Brown, established the Turkish, the Confederation of Turkish Workers' Union. Its leader declared to struggle, quote, "against the abominable communism." The state-affiliated trade union would receive lots of funding from the Agency for International Development, a US body that works closely with the CIA. In its program some years later, the union declared that it, quote, "pursues a policy that has the aim of eliminating the causes of the deepening of class differences and class conflicts, and aims to establish balance, peace, and cooperation between the classes." After World War I, Irving Brown, along with CPUSA member turned CIA helper J. Lovestone, became known as splitters of unions who organized against communist influence in the labor movement. Brown gave money to anti-communist currents which broke strikes in Italy or France, for instance. It's really amazing how far Western powers went and still go to pacify workers and hinder them from developing revolutionary consciousness. The Menderes clique was more sympathetic toward the US, and it had a more positive stance toward conservative religious groups than the CHP, thus gaining support from sections frustrated with Kemalist secularization. With the rising influence of the US, the DP further bolstered its potential for electoral victory because it coincided with the American wishes to privatize state enterprises and a general westernization of Turkey. After the DP's rise to power, Turkey sent troops to the Korean War in 1950 to ensure membership in NATO, which had formed in 1949. Anti-communist persecution intensified and coincided with McCarthyism in the US. The state targeted not just organized Marxists, but university professors and various progressive intellectuals and journalists. American experts poured in to advise Turkey in westernizing education, teaching children the merits of self-responsibility, the evils of collectivism, reintroducing religious courses, and connect them to anti-progressive propagandizing, showing anti-communist educational movies, and so on. The Pentagon was also aware that fostering and utilizing reactionary Turkish nationalism would serve their strategic interests, as it was a potent deterrent against communist ideas. The Office of Policy Coordination, OPC, was the covert action arm of the CIA and unambiguously called in its charter for, quote, propaganda, economic warfare, preventative direct action, including sabotage, anti-sabotage, demolition and evacuation measures, subversion against hostile states, and support of indigenous anti-communist elements. Indigenous anti-communist elements is, of course, a much nicer expression than fascists. By the end of 1951, Turkey had received over $400 million in military aid along with 1,200 US military advisors. Within the next 3 decades, Turkey would receive a further $5.8 billion in military support, including training programs and arms supply. Those aid packages, as usual, had hundreds of strings attached, such as Turkey allowing the Americans to restructure its military and secret service apparatus, or the commitment to buy US products. One example of that is the US forcing Turkey to focus on building automobile highways and airports, as opposed to railroads, through obliging them to focus on importing automobiles and petroleum, which are of course a much bigger opportunity to make a profit. Then, naturally in 1952, Turkey officially became a member of NATO. The country was key for the Western powers, guarding a third of NATO's total borders with the communist bloc and serving as an important balcony for US operations in the Middle East. And then, as left organization, demonstrations, and the opposition to US imperialism intensified, in the shadows of the NATO membership announcement, a secret, bloody fascist network had already begun to spread its tentacles. As a result of Turkey becoming an appendage of US imperialism, and due to the rapidly rising popularity of communist and progressive ideas, it naturally became involved with the notorious Operation Gladio, a secret army intelligence complex organized by NATO and the CIA in collaboration with intelligence agencies throughout Europe to counter the communist threat. Gladio was so powerful and vast, and yet the intelligence agencies managed to largely keep it a secret for decades. It was not until the 90s when it was officially revealed by Italian politician Giulio Andreotti. The revelation was a bombshell and made waves around the world. The operation was particularly brutal in Italy, Greece, and Turkey. In each of these countries, violent fascist or neo-Nazi groups were used to crush the left, such as in Italy, where progressive movements were infiltrated and where fascist terrorist attacks were blamed on the left wing to discredit it, all with the help of state security. I've made a video on Gladio in Italy, which you should check out after watching this. But it is in Turkey where the secret army was the most violent and brutal. The Turkish branch of Gladio was created in the same year when Turkey joined NATO under the codename Counter-Guerilla, and it was located in the building of the Joint American Military Mission for Aid in the Turkish capital, Ankara, which became the largest of the US European commands. And who was one of its founding members? None other than the aforementioned Hitlerite Alparslan Türkeş. The Turkish National Security Service, MAH, received financial support from the CIA. Leading members of the Turkish Gladio were recruited from this agency. The CIA under Alan Dulles assigned former Nazi officers Wehrmacht General Reinhard Gehlen, Butcher of Lyon and Che Guevara hunter Klaus Barbie, and various other fascists to train the Gladio leaders, including MAH officers in the camps from the Unconventional Warfare Department. In 1951, the Communist Party was crushed and all of its leaders and most members were imprisoned through the notorious mass arrests ordered by the Menderes government, in full coherence, of course, with its proclamations of multi-party democracy. The Turkish Gladio was already active here, but it was not until a few years later, in 1955, when it was involved in its first major operation. The Democrat Party orchestrated a secret action along with the counter-guerrilla to bomb the Turkish consulate in Thessaloniki in Greece, in the house where Atatürk was born. The so-called free press in Turkey would then spread the story suggesting that it was the Greeks who set off the bomb. What followed would result in thousands of Greeks fleeing their homes. In what came to be known as the Istanbul pogrom, or the Turkish Kristallnacht, the state, along with the counter-guerrilla, carried out and supported mob attacks against Greeks, Armenian or Jewish people, destroying their small businesses or abusing hundreds of Greek women, with the police being demonstrably present and doing nothing. And in the most ridiculous way possible, Menderes then blamed the communists, who had been themselves already crushed by the state, for carrying out those pogroms. And subsequently, 45 so-called card-carrying communists were arrested. This type of false flag action and propaganda was a core tool of the Gladio operations, not just in Turkey. The Menderes government grew increasingly unpopular. Money from the Marshall Plan ran out, and after the first severe economic crisis of Turkish capitalism in the 50s, it lost the support of both the parliament and the people. Under the pressure from the US, which saw Turkey as a breadbasket of the West, the DP had unilaterally promoted the agricultural sector with the funds of the Marshall Plan and renounced the development of heavy industry. Due to the massive foreign trade deficit amounting to 60% of total exports, urgently needed industrial goods such as machines and raw materials could no longer be imported. By borrowing from the World Bank and the IMF, Turkey continued to run up debt until it could no longer pay its foreign debts. Menderes reacted to the opposition by arresting his political rivals and critical journalists. Unfortunately, much of the indignation of the Turkish masses was channeled into organizations who were themselves reactionary. As Kaypakkaya wrote, since there was no communist leadership to show the way to the masses, the popular opposition followed this or that reactionary clique and was squandered. This is what always happens in situations of crises. Frustration and indignation get co-opted and channeled into movements that don't endanger the capitalist system, such as reformism and even fascism. Menderes was then deposed and was executed in the 1960 coup d'etat by the military officers, the first of several coups in the Republic of Turkey. The CIA-linked and US-trained Alparslan Türkeş was one of those commanders, and his clique wished to implement its fascist program. But the faction favoring a multi-party system around the coup leader, General Cemal Gürsel, who then became president, won out, and a new constitution was approved in 1961. The US wasn't too worried about this, as Gürsel quickly emphasized, Turkey remains faithful to its Western alliance. Now, former Prime Minister İsmet İnönü of the CHP was once again elected to restore freedom. Unsurprisingly, that didn't last very long. Colonel Alparslan Türkeş attempted again to take power in 1963, but his coup attempt failed and he was put in jail. Comically, he was then released shortly afterward on the basis of a supposed lack of evidence. Now he was free to greatly affect Turkish politics in the coming years. In 1965, he founded the infamous National Action Party, short MHP, and more importantly, along with it, its youth organization and fascist paramilitary wing, the notorious Bozkurtlar, known in English as the Grey Wolves. Its ideology, the superiority of the Turkish race. Quote, "What is the source of this superiority? The Turkish blood." Its goal, Turan, a united Turk state from Eastern Europe to Xinjiang. Quote, "Our struggle goes to the last man, to the last breath, to the last drop of blood. Our struggle continues until nationalist Turkey, until Turan is reached." The CIA and NATO-trained Turkish initiated the movement with the purpose to establish a nationalist movement that could counter the communist efforts domestically and internationally. And the Grey Wolves would soon wreak havoc on left-wing activists. Naturally, whenever fascist paramilitaries are created, the eyes of the Yankee CIA defenders of democracy and freedom shine with excitement.
Then Jim Angleton appeared in August. He began recruiting fascists because he figured that the best way to control the communists was to hire fascists.
CIA officer Ray Klein said in an interview on Operation Gladio in Italy, quote, "It was not far-fetched that some far-right groups were recruited because after all, they would be the only ones to warn us if there was a risk of a war against the communists in Italy." Former CIA agent Philip Agee, who wrote books revealing sensitive information, stated that, quote, "Paramilitary groups, directed by CIA officers, operated in the 60s throughout Europe, and perhaps no activity of the CIA could be as clearly linked to the possibility of internal subversion." Mehtap Söyler explains in her book how Western powers used Operation Gladio to promote Turanism in Turkey through Alparslan Türkeş as a founding member of the counter-guerrilla. In 1965, a new intelligence agency was formed with the help of the CIA, the National Intelligence Organization, or short MIT, not to be confused with this MIT. The MIT soon penetrated, quote, "the entire fabric of the Turkish society." Many MIT members and Grey Wolves, which one could barely distinguish at that point, would join the Gladio counter-guerrilla. The MIT and the counter-guerrilla were institutionally united, and from 1967 operated out of the secret CIA-sponsored Special Warfare Department in Ankara. The central goal of the department being, quote, "in the case of a communist occupation or of a rebellion, to use guerrilla methods and all possible underground activities to bring an end to the occupation." The CIA was so successful in creating a massive web of Turkish secret services, even MIT officers would acknowledge they were dependent on Washington. In 2008, a court document during the so-called Ergenekon trials revealed that the MIT had funded and armed members of the Grey Wolves in order to carry out political assassinations, such as against Kurdish or Armenian liberation fighters. Toward the end of the 60s, MIT members would also cooperate with the Israeli Mossad to murder Palestinians. In Turkey, another economic recession worsened the situation dramatically. At the end of the decade, social unrest intensified, labor strikes, student riots, political assassinations, and so on. Turkey had adopted 5-year plans in the 60s, not the socialist ones, but state-directed capitalist ones, to develop industry through import substitution. This led to rapid growth of the working class, going from 2.2 million wage earners to almost 4 million by 1970, including 600,000 women who previously worked in agriculture or at home. Due to the more liberal constitution of 1961, worker organizing was made easier. Hence, trade union membership tripled to 1 million throughout the 60s. The increased labor organizing caused headaches among industry leaders. Something had to be done about it. In February of 1969, during the so-called Bloody Sunday, tens of thousands of left-wing students and workers marched on Taksim Square in Istanbul to protest against the arrival of the US Sixth Fleet. Among the key leaders of that protest was a certain Deniz Gezmiş. More on him later. The Association for the Fight Against Communism had called for a counter-demonstration. During the rally, right-wing extremist groups, with the protection of law enforcement and with some of them controlled by the Turkish counter-guerrilla, attacked the protesting people with knives, chains, and sticks. 2 protesters were killed and over 100 were injured, all under the eyes of the police, who merely attacked the left, but not their buddies from the right. The working class did not forget those who fell on Bloody Sunday. A year later, the state-affiliated Turkish Trade Union Confederation had requested an amendment to the trade union law which would have effectively led to the closure of the more left-wing Disk Union. After the amendment went into effect, unions called for protests on June 13. 20,000 people were expected, but when 150,000 workers took to the streets of Istanbul, even the trade union leadership was shocked. The most brutal police repression, all the tanks and gunshots, couldn't stop the protesters. Only a state of emergency, which was declared 3 days later, could bring this historic protest to an end. It was this massive worker struggle in June of 1970, which is now considered among the largest of organized labor in Turkey's history, which Kaypakkaya considered to be, quote, proof that the objective conditions of the revolution have become mature in Turkey. The ruling classes concurred and interpreted the 2-day workers' uprising as the beginning of a systemic crisis of Turkish capitalism. Something big needed to be done quickly to save the system from the wrath of the people. The social unrest would lead into another major coup in 1971, ushering in one of the bloodiest decades of recent Turkish history, where thousands would die at the hands of CIA-assisted right-wing terror. At the beginning of 1971, Turkish society was in mayhem. Turkey's second coup was only a matter of time. Labor strikes exploded everywhere. Universities stopped working and young left-wing activists robbed banks, attacked US targets, and created urban guerrillas. The dominant party at the time was the Justice Party, a descendant of the Democrat Party of Menderes. The Justice Party's Süleyman Demirel, who had been elected in 1965 as Turkey's youngest prime minister, was overwhelmed with the chaos, and the military apparatus didn't like that. Chief of the General Staff, Memduh Damac, demanded a strong government which will, quote, neutralize the current anarchical situation. After Demirel's refusal to grant the military more political influence in the anti-uprising struggles, the generals had enough. the tanks were deployed, and Tamac handed the Prime Minister a memorandum in March, meaning, either you resign or we'll depose you. Demirel, not having a real choice here, resigned, and the military leaders took over, exhibiting that in the modern state, the gun has the last word. But the chaos didn't stop. By the end of April, martial law was declared once more. Strikes and union meetings were prohibited. Thousands of people, communists, trade unionists, left-leaning academics, and journalists, faced harsh sentences and suffered systematic torture. Left publications were banned and confiscated. The fascist ones were left untouched, of course. After the People's Liberation Army of Turkey, short THKO, abducted an Israeli consul in May, the government escalated their ruthless repression. The 1961 constitution was regarded as too permissive of left ideologies and was amended. Meanwhile, the infamous Ziverbey Villa in Istanbul served as a torture center, where the CIA trained specialists and the Grey Wolves in the MIT anti-counterguerilla interrogated countless people, employing physical and psychological torture. It's here where the term counterguerilla was mentioned for the first time to anyone who wasn't a member. A well-known journalist who was tortured there later wrote that they told him, quote, "We are the counterguerilla. Even the President of the Republic cannot touch us." As repression and the contradictions within Turkish society intensified, and due to events in France, Vietnam, or China, a new wave of organizations emerged, and its leaders had one immediate goal: revolution. The communist movement was seriously weakened. The revisionist parties who had ossified in the hopes of changing Turkey through democratic reforms were crushed themselves. It was the military crackdown and, importantly, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution in China which inspired a new upsurge in revolutionary organization. There were three notable organizations that were initiated by radical students in this period: the aforementioned THKO, the THKPC, and the Communist Party of Turkey Marxist-Leninist, short TKP-ML. If you are confused, don't worry, because there were 100 other left-wing organizations in Turkey. But it's important to keep these three in mind, particularly the last one. Founded by Ibrahim Kaypakkaya in 1972, it accepted Mao's contributions as a higher stage in the development of Marxism. The party would follow Marxism-Leninism-Maoism and the strategy of waging revolution through protracted people's war. Kaypakkaya had been banned from his school for his political activism. He later went to study physics in Istanbul and became known as a great theorist and organizer in the student movement of the late 60s, which was partially inspired by the 1968 events in France. Kaypakkaya had split from another organization due to their rightist line, such as their chauvinist position on the Kurdish people, paying lip service to their struggle for self-determination, but ultimately remaining vague or straight-up opposing the formation of a separate Kurdish state. As one of the few original theoreticians of socialism in Turkey, Kaypakkaya made fundamental theoretical contributions already at age 22. A leader from his former organization even assigned someone to go kill him, but that someone turned out to be a sympathizer of Kaypakkaya and didn't do it. Kaypakkaya stressed that the struggle against revisionism was essential in the fight against capitalism, not least because of how deep Turkish chauvinism penetrated the broader left in Turkey, and how it would hold the proletariat back from forming genuine unity among different nationalities and from developing revolutionary consciousness. To this day, Kemalism is a big problem within the so-called Turkish left, much in the same way chauvinism and opportunism plague the left in other countries. The Turkish left is known especially for being fractured into 1,000 pieces. And let's remember here that wrecking and splitting the left, or disseminating ideas to pacify it with the establishment, are still two key tools of the CIA and their counter-subversion partners around the world. Many among the Turkish left would rely on hopes to find help from progressive officers in the military, cozying up to a supposed anti-imperialist trend within the CHP, instead of formulating a definite, independent path toward revolution, breaking with bourgeois illusions, reformism, and Kemalism. Kaypakkaya and the TKPML created the Liberation Army of the Workers and Peasants of Turkey, short TİKO, which formed guerrilla units in Dersim at first, now renamed to Tunceli by the Turkish state, where the aforementioned Dersim genocide took place, and which Kaypakkaya considered as having the best conditions to start a revolutionary movement. The National Intelligence Organization, or the MIT, concluded in a report, quote, "Within the communist movement in Turkey, Ibrahim Kaypakkaya's ideas are the most dangerous. The views he presents in his writings and the methods of struggle he advocates are, as we can safely say, the application of revolutionary communism to Turkey." The Turkish state knew what needed to be done with the utmost urgency. Kaypakkaya had to be eliminated. Among the most important student leaders at the time was the Kurdish Deniz Gezmiş, a founding member of the THKO, considered by many as Turkey's Che Guevara. He was repeatedly arrested and injured during his political activism. After Gezmiş managed to escape from the hospital while under surveillance, he traveled to the Palestine Liberation Organization camps in Jordan to undergo guerrilla training. He and other THKO members were arrested after robbing 2 banks and kidnapping 4 US soldiers in Ankara. Gezmiş and 17 others were sentenced to death in October of 1971. The sentence was presented to the parliament in 1972 and it was overwhelmingly approved. Alparslan Türkeş was among those who voted in favor of the death sentence. But his comrades would not give him up without putting up a fight. Among them, self-described anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninist, firm supporter of Stalin and admirer of Che Guevara, Mahir Çayan, the leader of the THKPC. In order to demand the freedom of Deniz Gezmiş and his comrades, and to prevent their execution, Çayan and 10 accomplices abducted 3 NATO technicians. But in March 1972, in the Kızıldere massacre, the group was spotted and surrounded by soldiers later revealed to be the Gladio counter-guerrilla forces. And in the resulting gunfire, almost everyone present, including the hostages, was killed. Çayan died at age 26. The operation was led by Fehmi Altınbilik, member of the counter-guerrilla through the Special Warfare Department. It's not the last time Fehmi would play a key role in the assault on revolutionaries. A month later, the president ordered the execution of 25-year-old Gezmiş and his comrades. Before he was executed by hanging on May 6th in 1972, he requested to drink tea and listen to Joaquín Rodrigo's Concierto de Aranjuez. His last words were, "Long live a fully independent Turkey. Long live the great ideology of Marxism-Leninism. Long live the Turkish and Kurdish people's fight for independence. Damned be imperialism. Long live the workers and the villagers." After the destruction of the guerrillas of Gezmiş and Çayan, the state now focused its forces on Kaypakkaya's TİKO. As opposed to Çayan's approach, which foresaw guerrilla units forming in the cities first before expanding into the countryside, the TKPML started in the rural areas. Aside from that, there were other differences between their strategies: Çayan's politicized military war strategy, or PAS, and the protracted People's War of the TKPML. But this examination will be part of another video on Marxist military theory. The THKO of Gezmiş followed an approach closer to the Foucault theory going back to Che Guevara, and later further popularized by French writer Régis Debray, which put the guerrilla unit at the center of revolutionary change. Guerrillas were key for the TKPML as well. However, as the People's War strategy prescribed, the guerrilla is subordinate to the party. The goal is to ground the People's Army on the population's mass support. Politics is in command of the rifle, so to speak. So, Kaypakkaya and his comrades, among them the Kurdish communist Ali Haydar Yıldız, went to the villages in Dersim, doing research on the terrain and the class composition in the towns, organized actions against big landlords who tyrannized people, helping villagers with their agricultural work, knocking on doors and listening to their problems. This worked very well. Kaypakkaya was well liked by the villagers. The Turkish forces knew about these young revolutionaries going around from town to town spreading their dangerous ideology, and the military commando launched a plan to move into the Dersim villages. Understanding these strategies and nip them in the bud was key for the CIA and the counter-guerrilla. Vietnam had just shown them that it's not always the bigger military force which prevails. It's not easy for the superior military to fight against the People's War strategy, since it's very tough to beat an army that is directly supported by the surrounding population politically, as analyzed by the RAND Corporation, a US national security think tank. One tactic of the military personnel was to disguise themselves as revolutionaries and to knock on doors. If the villagers sympathized with them, they knew whom to keep an eye on and whom to terrorize. But fortunately for Kaypakkaya and Ali Haydar, the families hid them very well at their places. The police and military terror against the population increased. Torture and beatings became part of everyday life in Dersim, even becoming a major issue in the Turkish parliament. The region was virtually surrounded by the military commandos. Head of the commando, the aforementioned counter-guerrilla member, Fehmi, who led the operation that killed Mahir Cayan. One early morning in January 1973, Kaypakkaya and his comrades were staying in a village called Vartinik when they made an encounter with the enemy. As the Turkish soldiers approached, they tried to flee but were hit by bullets and pretended to be dead. Although the rest of the group escaped, Yıldız was unable to do so and eventually succumbed to his wounds. Kaypakkaya escaped with multiple bullets in his body and managed to stay alive in the snowy mountains for a few days.
Silah kucağında, kanlar içinde vurulmuş yatıyor İbrahim yoldaş, İbrahim yoldaş. Yiğitler ölür mü 3-5 kurşunla? Doğrulmuş kalkıyor İbrahim yoldaş. Ali Haydar yerde, bak yüzü boylu, yiğitçe can verir. Yiğidin oğlu, yiğidin oğlu. Başı duman duman, munzura doğru tırmanmış gidiyor İbrahim yoldaş.
Kaypakkaya was seeking a hiding place in a nearby village, but this time he was unlucky. He asked someone for directions, but the village resident was shocked at Kaypakkaya's condition and took him back to their home. They notified a village teacher, but unfortunately, this teacher happened to be a reactionary. The region's mission command had already established contact with him, and he knew very well who Kaypakkaya was. The military forces got wind of Kaypakkaya's whereabouts and surrounded the village. The head of the command, Lieutenant Fehmi, ripped open the door and yelled, quote, "You are Ibrahim Kaypakkaya, aren't you?" "If you know, why are you asking?" replied Kaypakkaya in a razor-sharp voice. Then he was asked how he had escaped, Fehmi not being able to cope with the fact that he had slipped through his fingers. I clenched my teeth and fled, as is necessary to escape such fascists as you, replied Kaypakkaya. Despite being brutally tortured every day for over 3 months, he did not reveal any information about the TKPML's internal organization or the identities of his comrades or villagers who helped him. He said, for the revolution, quote, give your life, but don't give your secrets. He died from torture on the night of May 18, 1973, at the age of 25. His last recorded words were, quote, what I have done, I did for the sake of the Marxist-Leninist idea in which I sincerely believe, and I have absolutely no regrets as regards the outcome. I waged a struggle to this end, taking into account all possible consequences, and was arrested. I have no regrets. If one day I escape from your hands, I will work again in the same way. I will always work hard for the proletariat no matter what, as I believe in the liberation of the working people. I have put aside all of my personal interests and goals for the greater good of our people.
Halkımız arıyor seni her yerde, işçiler ocakta, köylüler dağda, köylüler dağda. Dökülen kanların kalmayacak yerde, hesap soracağız İbrahim yolda.
The leading cadres of the three main guerrilla groups were thus wiped out by 1973, a huge win for the fascist state. As the counter-guerrilla continued to rapidly expand its operations, a new prime minister was elected in 1974, Bülent Ecevit of the CHP, who would soon order the invasion of Cyprus. In the same year, he said he was shocked to notice that there was a US-financed clandestine force operating in Turkey. The Turkish army general cautioned him against delving too deeply into the matter, as it pertained to the greatest state secrets. But Ecevit's suspicions proved to be utterly correct. I hope you're still here. Take a deep breath, because now we're gonna look at the most brutal sequence of years covered in this video. Considering the events in the early 70s, it's hard to believe that it got much worse toward the latter half of the decade, a period which many people describe as a civil war. In 1975, the Justice Party's Süleyman Demirel succeeded Ecevit as president. Remember that he was the guy who got couped in 1971. He now led a coalition with various right-wing parties, including Alparslan Türkeş's far-right MHP. The MHP now managed to infiltrate state security services directly, increasing the strength of the fascist death squads and exacerbating the ongoing repression of left-wingers. The coalition implemented so-called neoliberal policies, going along with many of the capitalist governments in the 70s. This did not exactly calm down the furious masses, as it further deepened the crisis. The government looked anything but stable. In these years, prime ministers switched more quickly than managers at Chelsea Football Club. Turkey had 10 different PMs in the 70s. But one thing remained stable and constant: the so-called deep state of Turkey, along with its CIA assistants and its fascist militia detachments. The modern concept of the deep state is in fact something that predominantly came from an understanding of the secret network of military officers and their civilian partners in Turkey, and the involvement of the counter-guerrilla structure in the fight against communism. But the so-called deep state is nothing particularly spectacular. It just refers to the state bureaucracy which isn't visible to the public and which is an essential feature of any capitalist state apparatus. Liberals like to downplay this or frame it as a conspiracy theory in order to salvage the image of liberal democracy. But there is no conspiracy. It's just what's reproduced within capitalist class society. The modern state needs a stable bureaucracy in foreign policy, national security, lobbyists and corrupt officials tied to the private sector through 1,000 threads, through which it can systematically guard the interests of the wealthy. This is just what the bourgeois state is supposed to do. In 1976, a certain Recep Tayyip Erdoğan entered politics by joining an anti-communist action group, the National Turkish Student Union, one of many right-wing organizations emerging at the time, who were soon to meet an opportunity to lash out in a big way. On International Workers' Day in 1977, over 500,000 protesters gathered at the Taksim Square in Istanbul. And then, all of a sudden, some people opened fire on the crowd. Masked snipers shot people from nearby buildings, such as the Intercontinental Hotel. The massive crowd panicked. The shooting lasted for about 20 minutes. Around 40 people were killed and about 200 injured. Over 500 protesters were detained by the police. During the whole 20 minutes, thousands of police officers who were on the scene just stood there and did not intervene. Who started the shooting? Opposition leader Bülent Ecevit suspected it was the counter-guerrilla. Quote, "Some organizations and forces within the state, but outside the control of the democratic state of law, have to be taken under control without losing time. The counter-guerrilla is running an offensive and has a finger in the May 1st incident." Leaders of trade unions stated that this was clearly a plan of the CIA. One of them said that there were Americans in the Intercontinental Hotel and that the hotel had been closed to the public on that day. 3 days before the incident, it was allegedly emptied and had stopped taking reservations. The hotel was owned by the ITT Corporation, which had close connections to the CIA and that had been involved in financing the coup against Salvador Allende in 1973 in Chile. According to a Turkish magazine, the MIT deputy chief was present on the day of the massacre. Ankara's deputy state attorney, Doğan Öz, concluded in his final report that the, quote, "military and civilian security services are behind all this work. The counter-guerrilla are subordinate to the Special Warfare Department." Shortly after releasing his report, Öz was assassinated. His killer, well-known member of the Grey Wolves, Ibrahim Çiftçi, who mocked the courts for not being able to touch him. He was right. Çiftçi was set free even after he confessed to the crime. He is now an official member of the MHP. Look at this guy's Twitter profile, looking healthy and fine, as if nothing ever happened. The Turkish state, of course, denied any involvement of the CIA and, in the usual, most ridiculous manner, even blamed the left for the killings. Not a single perpetrator of the May Day massacre was ever caught and brought to justice. But this was just the beginning to all the massacres that followed in the next few years. Such as the Beyazıt massacre of 1978 at the University of Istanbul, perpetrated by the Grey Wolves, in which 7 students were killed. Witnesses stated that the police didn't do anything against the perpetrators at the scene. The leader of the Istanbul Grey Wolves, and one of those responsible, was sentenced to prison for 11 years, but was released again 2 years later. After the 30-year statute of limitations expired, the mother of a shooter admitted that her son was involved and that he had been ordered by the police to commit the massacre. A few months later in the same year, another 7 university students in Ankara were brutally murdered by the Grey Wolves in the Bahçelievler massacre. Grey Wolves leader, Abdullah Çatlı, the drugs dealer and friend of the Istanbul police chief I mentioned at the beginning, was a key person involved in those killings. Çatlı was being paid by the MIT at the time in heroin. And then, in December 1978, the Grey Wolves would commit its most vicious massacre of the 70s. In Maraş, a region which was hit especially hard in the 2023 earthquakes, more than 100 Alevi Kurds and left-wingers were murdered primarily by the fascists. About 5,000 people lost their lives in the 1970s. communists, trade unionists, intellectuals, workers, or their family members, most of them at the hands of the far right. That's about 10 murders per day. Over 3,300 fascist attacks were counted in 1978 alone. The people of Turkey and Kurdistan will never forget this decade. At the end of the 70s, Supreme Court Justice Emin Değer documented evidence of cooperation between the Grey Wolves, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the counter-guerrilla, showing how the counter-guerrilla organization distributed weapons to various right-wing terrorist groups. The Turkish Minister of Foreign Affairs in the late 70s said, quote, "The CIA is able to pick and choose in my intelligence service without let or hindrance." Following the Maraş massacre, the state once again declared martial law in 14 provinces. Many more people would die due to fascist attacks, such as at prominent cafes in Istanbul, frequented by leftists. Ultimately, no matter how much they tried, no matter how many communists they killed and tortured, the state-supported fascists couldn't erase the light of the quickly growing revolutionary disposition of the masses. The ruling class had no other option than to resort to yet another military coup to restore quote-unquote law and order and smash the left in Turkey once and for all. The economic crisis in Turkey worsened dramatically as oil prices skyrocketed, bringing inflation to 3 digits. The balance between Ecevit's CHP and Demirel's Justice Party proved not dictatorial enough to put an end to the chaos in Turkey. So, the military generals met in 1979 to make a plan for another coup, using the pretext of restoring political unity. The most important military leader and organizer of the coup was a man called Kenan Evren. At the time of the coup in September 1980, Evren had been head of a certain organization. You guessed it. He was the chief of the Special Warfare Department and commander of the counter-guerrilla secret army. Evren had excellent relations with the US. In 1978, he had met with National Security Council Zbigniew Brzezinski, who allegedly told him that the coup was a good idea, since the US needed a stable Turkey. Quote, "For Turkey, as for Brazil, a military government would be the best solution." In his memoirs, Evren wrote that Demirel asked him to engage the Special Warfare Department to deal with the unrest. Evren also calmed the fears of Ecevit by allegedly telling him, quote, "There is nothing to worry about. We will deal with it." In the late night of September 12, 1980, the armed forces began sending tanks to Ankara, occupying television, radio, and party buildings. Evren announced martial law and all political parties were banned. Strikes were prohibited, local governors were replaced by military personnel, leaving the country was made illegal, and 50 people were immediately executed. Within a short period of time, more than 500,000 people were detained, many of them tortured, and 1.7 million people were blacklisted. Many communist leaders were captured, then tortured, then murdered, such as Kurdish communist and second general secretary of the TKPML after Kaypakkaya, Süleyman Cihan. The police claimed he committed suicide, but an autopsy pretty much confirmed he was murdered and then thrown from the 6th floor. The repression against Kurdish people escalated. The Kurdish language was banned, those who spoke or sang in Kurdish were imprisoned, and in November 1978, in the province of Diyarbakir, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, short PKK, was founded, initially with a Marxist-Leninist orientation to bring about a Kurdish state through a revolution. But there was also an ideological assault on communism, not just through the assassination of its brightest leaders, but also through the conscious attempt to rid Turkey of its working-class consciousness, such as renaming a left-wing stronghold in Istanbul from 1st of May neighborhood to Mustafa Kemal neighborhood. A man called Paul Hentze was the CIA station chief in Turkey at the time and one of the best friends of Alparslan Türkeş. He encouraged Brzezinski to form the Nationalities Working Group, which promoted the use of Islamism as a means to challenge Soviet ideology in Central Asia. Think about this sort of stuff the next time someone says that the West promotes secular values in the world. Paul Hentze would later say something interesting in an interview about the coup.
Ulusal Güvenlik Konseyi'nden bir meslek memurunun beni aradığını hatırlıyorum. Ankara'daki çocuklar yaptılar gibi bir şey söyledi.
The working class was also assaulted in the economic sphere, under the pretext of, quote, revitalizing the economy. The head of the central bank was forcibly replaced because he was against the IMF, in order to complete the subjugation of Turkey to the global capitalist system, allowing foreign capital to pour in without any control, privatizing whatever could be privatized, making Turkey even more export-dependent, thus giving multinational corporations ultimate free rein. The bankers' press was more enthusiastic than ever before during this time. Coup leader Kenan Evren was now president of Turkey. Hundreds of laws were pushed through, such as guaranteeing impunity for the military junta leaders or to discipline society militarily, and a new constitution was put in place. However, while the military dictatorship proved to be an effective beast in suppressing the rapidly rising revolutionary sentiment with the utmost brutality, it ultimately failed in silencing the fierce resistance and breaking it completely. Enough was enough. In 1984, the PKK had announced a full-scale uprising and declared war on the Turkish state. After having played a key role in instigating the 1980 coup, Alparslan Türkeş was imprisoned by the high command, and a general within the army even pushed for his execution by a firing squad. The aforementioned fascist employed by the CIA, Ruzi Nazar, intervened, and Türkeş was spared. Following the coup, in an attempt to distance itself from the collaboration with the far right, a couple hundred grey wolves out of the 200,000 registered members were imprisoned. But now they were needed again in the escalating fight against the PKK. MIT members went to the prisons to make an attractive deal. In return for setting the grey wolves free and guaranteed income, they would help them fight against the Kurds. In the following fight against the PKK, tens of thousands of people died, while millions of Kurds were displaced from Turkey or Turkish Kurdistan. The counter-guerrilla would use one of its favorite tricks, which was to dress up as the enemy, in this case as PKK fighters, attack villages and commit abuse or executions in an attempt to weaken support for the enemy. Mosques were built in Alevi regions in order to replace Alevism with Sunni Islam, Kurdish language, political organizations, and newspapers, or the Nevros New Year celebrations were banned. The Kurdish identity was to be eliminated once and for all with the help of the counter-guerrilla and American helicopters, jets, and guns. In the usual hypocritical manner of the liberals, Bill Clinton would later state that, quote, Turkey is a shining example to the world of the virtues of cultural diversity, while sending arms to kill Kurds. One among many notable Kurdish fighters was member of the PKK Central Committee Mazlum Doğan. Doğan had been imprisoned in 1979, and then, on March 21st in 1982, at the age of 27, Mazlum Doğan protested against the Turkish government's repression of Kurds and use of torture in prisons by setting himself on fire, through burning his prison cell and subsequently hanging himself. His act coincided with the Nevros festival, an important celebration among Kurds, during which Nevros fires are traditionally lit. Doğan's actions marked the beginning of a series of hunger strikes and resistance actions by political prisoners in 1982. Doğan's legacy has been honored by many Kurdish activists, and he's become a symbol of the Kurdish resistance. This video is already long, but keep in mind that only a fraction of what really occurred was covered here. I nonetheless hope this gave you a general idea of what occurred, and I encourage you to read the analysis of Turkish and Kurdish Marxists, such as the selected works of Kaypakkaya I have listed in the description. At this point, it is important to know that the anti-communist clandestine structures have not gone away. And why would they? The struggle against progressive ideas necessitates secrecy and the help of the most violent, reliable detachments of the capitalist ruling class, the Fascists. Secrecy is crucial, otherwise the general population might sympathize too much with the people who fight against the most reactionary elements of society which are allied with the state. The Social Democrats of Germany, for instance, would muddy the waters for decades about their collaboration with the only reliable force in their crushing of the German communists in the German Revolution, the Freikorps, which then built the basis for the Nazi movement. The secrecy of Western interference through Gladio in Turkey was also perhaps an important factor in boosting the influence of pseudo-left Kemalism, since many on the so-called left underestimated the degree of counter-revolutionary power which was embedded within the state apparatus. Despite its genocidal chauvinist positions, Turkey's MHP is to this day a powerful political force. The MHP had secured President Erdoğan's re-election through its alliance with his party in 2018. Connections between Erdoğan's party and the Grey Wolves are abundant, which is no big shock since Erdoğan's administration is genocidal and chauvinist itself. Erdoğan himself, coming from the fascist anti-left uprising tradition, being a member of one of many anti-communist organizations in the 70s, supported by the US. The Grey Wolves not only exert great influence in Turkey today, with more than 18,500 members nationwide, it constitutes the largest far-right organization in Germany. In Germany, too, the Grey Wolves are not only tolerated, but their presence was actively encouraged by German right-wing politicians so that they could terrorize the left in Germany as well, while the activities of several Turkish or Kurdish radical left organizations is prohibited. When Alparslan Türkeş died peacefully from heart failure at the age of 80 in 1997, his funeral is said to have been attended by 500,000 people. Kılıçdaroğlu himself has formed an alliance with the İyi Party, which is itself reactionary and which was formed as a result of a split from the fascist MHP. And as I hope to show, Kemalism is not exactly a positive force for minorities and the proper left in Turkey. Turkish fascism has not gone away. To the contrary, its roots have grown deep into society, watered and consciously fostered by US imperialism. Following Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti's revelations about the secret NATO army, the public pressure became too great, and in December of 1990, President of the Operations Department and the head of the Turkish Special Forces issued a press statement in response to public pressure, acknowledging the presence of secret NATO troops in Turkey and explaining that the Special Warfare Department was responsible for directing the counter-guerrilla unit with the objective, quote, to organize resistance in the case of a communist occupation. They made sure to emphasize that all members of the Turkish Gladio were, quote, patriots. Those patriots were once again important in the escalating fight against the PKK in the 90s. In 1993, a parliamentary commission conducted an investigation on the counter-guerrilla, but the Speaker of the Parliament at the time was immediately contacted by a general to stop the investigation, and the State Security Court prosecutor ordered the police not to collaborate with the parliamentary commission in their investigation efforts. In the late 90s, in the Susurluk scandal aftermath, a report concluded that, quote, an execution squad was formed within the state, and that, quote, all parts of the state were aware of what was going on. The Turkish Human Rights Association concluded that there are, quote, around 3,500 crimes of the counter-guerrilla which have been committed with the support of the state and which are covered up until today by the state. The president of that association, Akın Birdal, was then shot by Turkish nationalists and just barely survived. In 1997, millions of people throughout Turkey switched off their lights at exactly 9 p.m. for 1 minute to protest the lack of transparency and the government's efforts to hide its connection to criminal organizations. About 100,000 workers marched in Ankara, demanding the truth about the state's collaboration with the CIA and the counter-guerrilla. To this day, the US has not acknowledged any responsibility for what happened in Turkey. In Turkey, only military dictatorship and fascism proved enough to suppress the rising proletarian movement. It's about maintaining the private property relation and US hegemony. The US doesn't give a single F about anything else. For all the feelings of sadness and despair that this story evokes, it's always important to remember that no matter how much they try, the ruling classes will never be able to defeat communism completely. They can only slow down the inevitable abolition of this system of genocide and exploitation, and only delay the absolute self-determination of Kurdish, Armenian, and all oppressed peoples. No matter who wins in the election, the struggle will go on. This century of brutal repression has burned itself into the collective consciousness of the proletariat in Turkey and Kurdistan, and will serve as a lesson for the new coming wave of revolutionary power that will avenge its immortalized martyrs. The imperialists' alliance with Turkish fascism managed to contain the flames of the 20th century, but the fire of liberation can never be extinguished.
Sosyalist iktidara